Warda, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you. Thank you
So
for having
excited
me.
to have you on here. You were on the show, many years ago as a host. So it's nice to
Yeah.
have you back. And I think this time we're talking about a lot more of a serious, a grave topic and a difficult one. How do we talk to kids and how do we raise them, knowing that we live in a world where racism exists, right?
Yeah.
And part of it is, how do we raise kids so that they don't think they're weird or they're strange or they're the other, How do we raise them to have a really strong sense of identity, to be proud and confident of who they are? So I guess that's my first question to you. How do you do that? You have two kids, so
I do.
you can draw on your experience
Yeah.
with your kids, yeah.
So it is a heavy topic. It's not something that it's something that takes a bit of time and consideration and even exploring yourself as the adult who's leading the children to know yourself and where you stand in these topics and where your flaws are. So specifically raising kids who are confident in themselves, where I start and where a lot of us start is like knowing your family and knowing your family history, your family tree, the different identities that you have. A lot of us start with that, right? It's like, oh, this is your grandparents, this is the country that we came from, and this is the specific peoples that we came from in the countries that we come from. That's very important conversation to have. For me, while I'm having those conversations, it's also important for me to be mindful of not putting myself and my family and my background on a pedestal at the expense of others, which is something that happens fairly often, right? So having that conversation or being mindful of doing it in that manner is important. And then the other thing that I'm trying to do is being cognizant of the different aspects of our identities and teaching that, but also teaching my children what those identities mean, the social capital that it gives us, or the social capital that it takes away from us, right?
Yeah. So I guess in common terms we call that privilege, right?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
you want to help your kids to see where they have privilege and where they don't necessarily.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? And then
Why is it important for them to? Why do you think it's important for them to know what sort of privilege they have?
So they're going to be interacting with people who have different sets of privileges than them, right? Knowing where they stand, first of all, empowers them, but also it makes them not be the aggressors, right? And while we're doing this work, I also want to be compassionate and patient with my children. So it's like when they do falter, because we will, all of us fail and put our foot in our mouth kind of a thing, to kind of see how we can remedy the situation so that, we can go back if there's the possibility to go back and, kind of fix the situation or fix the problem, but also moving forward, what have we learned from this interaction and what could we do better? So those are some of the things that I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Now, what is your advice in terms of empowering children to fight racism and to work towards a more just and equitable world for all? I mean, that's really tough, I think.
It is. It is.
So how do you do that from a very young age?
So I'm trying to raise children who are gentle, who are kind, who are compassionate, but at the same time, I'm not trying to be confused and raise children who are naive, right?
Yes.
So it leads
if they're too gentle and too compassionate, then they won't fight for their rights,
Right.
So there's you need that balance.
And I think that empowerment comes from knowledge, right? So it's like all of the things that we talked about, knowing who they are, knowing where they stand in this hierarchical world, gives them that power, gives them that empowerment to fight or to be able to have a voice in the interactions that they're going to face in their world. The other thing is, and it's a very important thing, for us to be mindful of where our children, what our children are being exposed to. When we look at the television or the books that our children read, It's hard to find good role models.
Yes.
I know when I was growing up, a gajillion years ago, I literally did not have people who looked like me
I know,
in
yeah.
television. And if they did, they were ridiculous, right? I feel like it's a little bit better. I love that my kids have Black Panther to look up to, or their Miles Morales, the new Spider-Man. Like those are great role models. But my kids are young, and they're not being exposed to only those role models, right? Their favorite show right now is Paw Patrol. And
Well, they're being exposed to dogs now.
being exposed to dogs. But like, if you look at the one person of color in that show, the mayor, she's
Oh, yeah,
supposedly
Mayor
a Black
yeah.
woman, but she is so stereotypically negative stereotypes of what a Black woman is supposed to be, and it's very irritating to me because apparently she looks like me according to my kids. so
But
being
you know,
one-
it's funny because I think a non-black person might not even notice that, right?
Yeah, and sometimes I don't notice that. Sometimes I'll be watching something with my children, and I'll just be like, whoa, what's happening here? You know, I'll be reading a book, and you know, I'll be like, okay, literally, like I've read 30 pages of this book, and there wasn't a single person of color, nobody that looked like my children.
So do you tell your children? Do you say, like, did you notice that there's nobody that looks like me? Like, how would you have
They
that
notice
conversation with your
that.
child? They notice.
They
Okay.
notice that, and they notice when they notice someone who looks like them. So it's also very interesting. When someone is very negative, I will point that out, and I'll say, like, you know, we're not watching this show because A, B, C, D, right? My 6-year-old is a little bit more able to engage with me in that conversation, but my younger guy, he's 4, it's just kind of like, okay, this is a bad show, and we're just gonna cancel that out. Yeah.
Do you try to, I don't know if the right word is engineer, but like social situations, do you try to manage it? Because I find, like, let's say if I take my son, Adam, to the playground, I notice that some kids are really exclusionary and, you know, they don't try to include someone who's different, especially if someone looks different, you know, non-white, for example.
Yeah.
I find, and their parents are not usually involved. So, like, I notice that. Like, I'll notice, okay, that there's this child who's, you know, a different color or speaks a different language, and that person is not being included at all in the playground activity.
Yeah.
So would you recommend that people, you know, do something about that, parents do something about that?
So this is, I can draw back on my own childhood, and my mom did it exactly the way that you're doing it. Essentially when kids were doing something racist or like being exclusionary in that regard, my mom was very comfortable pointing that out.
Oh, okay.
Fortunately, unfortunately, I haven't had that happen to us, but it has happened in my kids' school. So I'm getting it kind of like after the fact. And then now what I do is kind of role play. Okay, so this happened, you know, and my son will be parroting what he heard, right? It's like, so-and-so is bad, da-da-da-da-da, or so-and-so is ugly. And I'm just like, okay, interesting.
Yeah. One time my son told me that 2 kids didn't want to play with him because they said he doesn't have blonde hair. So I was really surprised by that because they were pretty young, you know, they were 4 years old, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. See, the funny thing is, or the interesting thing for me that I learned was that kids as young as 5 to 9 months are able to show favoritism to people who look like them, right? So we have this notion that children are supposed to be like, you know, innocent, plain, not supposed to be prone to things of the adult world, but that's not the reality. Like kids as young as 4 are being exclusionary, right? And kids as young as, you know, 10 months, 9 months are like, you don't look like me, I don't want you, I don't trust you. Yeah.
You know, sometimes parents say, you know, my child doesn't notice color. How would you respond to that? Do you think we should aim for a colorblind society?
Absolutely not. When we say things like, I don't notice your color, or I don't notice, you know,
We're all the
essentially
same.
We're all
you
the
know?
same. We're all rainbows, you know, or anyways. So any of those things, to me, it tells me that this person is viewing this aspect of your identity as a negative, and they're kind of trying to compensate for that, right? so for example, for me, I'm an able-bodied woman. Imagine if I had said to someone in a wheelchair, I don't notice your wheelchair, you're just another person to me, I like you. To me, that is very invalidating. And this is so it's the same thing for me when someone says to me, I don't notice that you're black, or I don't notice that you're a Muslim woman. It's like, but I do, and they're important parts of my identity. They're not negative things. It's just, how do we have those conversations, or how do we interact? You know, while you see all of me and I see all of you. So when it comes to children, absolutely not. I do not want to raise children who are colorblind, who are supposedly invalidating people's experiences. I want children who are able to function in a world that people can be present in all of their different identities. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Now, Warda, how can we overcome our own limitations as parents? Because, you know, we live in a world in which, you know, there racism exists, and prejudice exists, and hate exists, and it filters into us in some ways. You know, even in very simple things like choosing, if you're deciding to buy a house, choosing what neighborhoods you're going to live in, right?
Oh God, yeah.
You can't really avoid your racist thoughts, you know.
Yeah.
So I feel like all of us have some, you know, we're not blameless in this, right?
Yeah.
So how do we overcome those limitations ourselves when we're trying to parent?
That's a very good question, and that kind of is the most basic part when it comes to this conversation. How do you parent? It's like knowing yourself. First of all, we need to understand the biology behind why people are exclusionary, right? It's our evolutionary brain. It's like we are driven to have in crowds and out crowds. This is how we survived for eons. We don't need necessarily that survival strategy in the GTA, but we have these impulses. So knowing the biology of like why we have racism in the first place and why we have ins and out crowds is also important. But also, like I said, knowing our identities, the different parts of our identities, and what privileges they give us and what privileges they take away from us, it moves us forward in that conversation. And like you said, like 100%, if you're coming in with the understanding that I am going to be biased, there's biology behind the reason why I'm biased. I live in a society that has enshrined these biases in a systemic way, and I've been being bombarded with these images since the day that I was born, therefore I'm going to be biased. I think it really helps, right? We have done this thing where we kind of put people in categories. You're either a bad person and you're racist and therefore you're a bad person. But if you're a good person, you cannot be biased. You cannot be racist. So it's like this dichotomy.
Which I think is wrong.
100% wrong. The minute that you point out to a person, or the minute that it comes to a person's consciousness that they have been biased or they have been bigoted or they have been racist, right away it's like, no, that's not possible because everything in my identity tells me otherwise. I am a good person. I cannot be these things, right? So it's like if we are able to get away from that line of thinking, it makes it so much easier for us to learn in our own private space and then be able to engage with people that we trust. Yeah.
What an important conversation, Warda. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.